at ISCORE today. My name is Sarah Wilson, and I'm here to introduce our panelists today in our session speakers. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin here. Just wanted to let you know and draw your attention, if you haven't been participating already in some other presentations, we do ask that you post any of your questions to the Q&A session. We will be sure to interact with you throughout the session. Also, just a reminder that when you're participating in our sessions and engaging with ISCORE, please be sure to follow all of our etiquette guidelines and the ISU principles of community. Please be sure to spend some time filling out the survey at the end of the session. If you haven't already, you'll see down at the bottom of your screen on the left side an option to rate the session. Please be sure to spend some time doing that. We would love to have your feedback. Our speakers today will be talking with us about the nuances of Black Native American community experiences. And our presenters this afternoon are Malcolm, who's a sophomore in agronomy and global resource systems. Helen, she's a senior in graphic design, and Jayda, a sophomore in kinesiology and health. Thanks for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And so we're going to go ahead and get started today and share our screen and just share a little bit more about what we're going to be talking about today. Perfect. Okay. To start us off, first of all, thank you for that introduction, Sarah. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about the nuances of the Black Native American identity. And so we want to start out with this quote by Jonathan Brennan from Where Brer Rabbit Meets Coyote. One might choose to proceed ignoring the well-worn paths of African and Native American traditions to either side. One might decide to turn back, returning to a road of familiarity. One might choose to follow only one path, either African or Native American, turning one's back on the tradition that lay across the way. Yet, one might instead choose to linger at the crossroads, sitting down for a drink, brimming with the salt water of the Middle Passage and the Trail of Tears. And we really want to use this quote to highlight the long history between these two identity groups.
All right, so just looking at this outline, this is kind of just outlining what the whole presentation is kind of going to go over. So first, we would like to recognize the land that we're all standing on today, that the university was built around, and that we understand that this was once the home of Native American tribes, and so just kind of acknowledging the land that we stand on today. And then going forward, we're kind of going to discuss who we are concerning positionality, as well as the perspective that kind of plays into this presentation today. Also, the history of Native American and Black communities. And so looking at the whole nuances of Black natives, you kind of have to look at the beginning of where everything kind of started. And then going further, we have the more contemporary and modern perspectives with my colleague, Malcolm. He'll be describing that, as well as going on with the blood quantum and how that kind of ties into land allotment, tribe membership, and things like that. Then we have individual stories. So during this research project, we did a lot of interviews concerning stories of either the Native identity or the Black Native identity, as well as the more history perspective of Black natives. And then lastly, we're going to wrap up the presentation before the questions with any recommendations for change concerning the community and the Iowa State community as well.
So we're going to start off with our positionality. Like we said, personally, I am biracial. My mom is Ugandan from East Africa, and my dad is American from Iowa. And so my perspective is not inherently connected to the Black Native American experience, but from a shared position of biracial and multicultural identity.
Yeah, to join Helen also, I wouldn't necessarily say biracial, but I was born in the United States. My mother is African American, but my father is Senegalese, West African. So I do also share that same experience of having two different backgrounds and what that can do to shape a person and how they think. So yeah.
All right, and then for me, I personally identify as Afro-Latinx. And so my dad is from Oaxaca, Mexico, and my mom is African-American. And so just kind of like finding that definitive line of who I am personally and the cultures that I share is kind of interesting. And then looking at the perspective from the presentation, I do not personally identify as Native American. So just looking at that moving forward was kind of an eye-opener concerning this research project. All right, so for this portion, we're going to be discussing the history of Native Americans, Black or African Americans, as well as the Black Native history. And so in the chat, just briefly for about 1 to 2 minutes, what do you guys currently know about Black Native Americans? And just looking at the chat very briefly, a lot of people are saying they know little to nothing. And so that's why I'm happy that everyone is joining us today to kind of get the experience to learn more about Blacks and African Americans and Native Americans. So kind of beginning with the first historical point of view of African Americans, the African American history kind of began in the English colony of Virginia in 1619, when about 20 plus Africans were brought to our land, kind of began that enslavement process. And so by the year 1790, the population of this demographic grew drastically to about 700,000. A lot of them were from either products of production, so slave to slave, reproducing, or that of more imported slaves. And so kind of just looking at the continued perspective of this, from the 17th and the 18th century, there was a thing called domestic slave trade. And so it was considered on the soil of what we consider the United States now. And it was pretty much the only thing legal at the time. And so this resulted in a lot of births from slave master to slave. And so a lot of these younger mothers, they were around the age of 13 years old to sometimes even younger. And so kind of just looking at that, you can kind of say it was a very, very tragic time for Africans and African Americans to have kids that young, to kind of keep the cycle going for slaves to be owned and things like that. And then so from this domestic slave trade, and we'll kind of go into this more often later, it also came the ownership of slaves from that of Native Americans. And so like in the past, even in history classes, high school, things like that, you don't ever really learn that natives owned slaves. It was really just the whites owned the Blacks. And then so looking at the Native American perspective from a historical point, the Native Americans, of course, have the earliest settlement on the United States soil, dating back all the way to 13,000 BCE. So long time ago. During that portion of time, and even considerably later, a lot of the states or the regions that we know of the United States were divided. And so you can kind of see that picture in the right-hand corner. So looking at like the plains, that's more of your hunters, your farmers and things like that, because of course, with the plains, it was a lot flatter land. There wasn't a lot of fishing to be done. There wasn't a lot of harvesting to be done, things like that. But then if you look at the areas of the Great Basin, Southwest, Northeast, and Southeast, you can kind of see that they're more by larger bodies of water. So those are your fishers, those are your better farmers, harvesters, things like that. And then, so of course, in the year 1492, Christopher Columbus was arriving in the Caribbean islands. And so that was somewhere around the coastal line of the United States now. And so that was kind of the first known existence of colonization of the United States. And so from those times of 1492 to 1830, there was a lot of battles, a lot of wars, with the inclusion of the Indian Removal Act by Andrew Jackson. And so pretty much what the Indian Removal Act was, just taking those natives from their land and kind of removing them to expand that colonization of the United States. And so moving forward with that, there was a lot of major policies during this colonization period within the communities of Native Americans. And so there was a lot of land removal, of course, but there was also an input of residential boarding schools during the time of the 1800s. And so during this time of residential boarding schools, they were taking the Native kids out of their tribal schools. So a lot of communities have schools on their tribal land. And so kind of taking that Native out of the kids was very important to them to kind of colonize their education, but as well as their overall learning. And so this was kind of initiated by an American general named Henry Pratt. And there's a famous quote that comes from Henry Pratt, and it's, you have to kill the Indian to build the man. And so pretty much with those schools that he was initiating, it was kind of killing their culture to kind of build a more wider society for them. And then so looking at the overall intersectional identity of Black Native Americans, you have the term mulatto. And so it's very important to understand that the term mulatto is a very derogatory term for anyone of multiracial, biracial standards. And so mulatto is kind of identified as the understanding that it was like a horse and a donkey put together. And so just kind of understanding that these were two races going into one. And so kind of just knowing that it is a term used for the combination of a horse and a donkey, you have to understand it is very derogatory and very downgrading for people. And so a lot of larger communities or tribes that have Black Native ancestry are included in the 5 larger civilized tribes. And so a few of them that I listed on here were the Cherokees, the Creek, the Wampanoag, and other tribes as well. And so the one important thing to understand is the Treaty of 1866. And so the Treaty of 1866 was kind of the initiation of removing slaves from the tribes, finally freeing them from slave ownership, but as well as them having to understand that if they wanted to continue to reside on that land, if they had nowhere else to go, they had to very hard for them to do that because they either weren't of Native ancestry or because they were African American, they weren't considered Native. And so that kind of plays into the whole Native slave ownership as well. And then so with that treaty comes the blood quantum, and Malcolm will explain this a lot more in his section, but it was kind of just understanding who could identify as that and who could own that land, who could be on that land and things like that. And that kind of goes into the Dawes Roll and the freedmen. So freedmen were considered Black natives, but at the same time, they weren't considered Native really at all. And the Dawes Roll was kind of just a larger stat board of what people were considered full, 1/8, 1/4, and freedmen. So freedmen were put on that roll, but at the same time, they weren't really considered to be natives at the same time. So in the late 1970s and the 80s, there was a lot of Indian gaining herb per capita. So from that time, you had a lot more people kind of trying to track that ancestry. And so they're like, oh, I'm 0.5 Native American, I should get this. Or I'm 10% Native American, I should get this. And so pretty much what they were doing was using that per capita to gain that profit, to gain those benefits for being Native American without fully recognizing and understanding the culture behind being Native American. And then with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Malcolm.
Thank you, Jayda. I really wanted to just sit and watch. That was nice. You made me just want to watch. So I'm going to be touching more on current events, as you can see, but Before we get there, I would like to ask a couple, just a starting question. If you were to, what is the physical portrait that comes to your mind when you hear an individual identifies as a Native American? If you guys could put that in the chat for me, that would be nice. So we can start from there, because we don't always necessarily, it is problematic how the United States categorizes its racial groups. So, and we wanna start from there. What comes to your mind when you hear that an individual identifies as Native American? Just a physical portrait. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's, I don't know, we'll see. We're gonna save the best for the last. As we can see here, in the United States, we would describe the physical portrait of these individuals in these pictures as African American. Yet, all of them do identify as natives. The one on my left, as you can see, is Kevin Gates. He's a hip hop artist. He's the co-owner of Breadwinner Records with his wife, Drika. I know that his fans would know that, but just a little bit of information. And then Curry Ivering, like all basketball fans know. But today we're not going to be talking about basketball. As you can see here, Curry Ivering is at, this picture was taken during his initiation ceremony to the Standing Rock tribe. It is him and his sister. So just to go back into our question in the beginning, it's not necessarily what we expect that we always get. And that's kind of what we want to dig into, because a lot of people, when we, like, as we said, as we talk of Native, you think long hair, you think so on and so far. But just to give us a peek about in the data, we're going to see what we have. So according to the 2018 American US Census, 5 million or close to that number self-identify as Native Americans in the United States and Canada. Yet before that, in 2017, the agency wanted to be more specific about the Native identity. So they proposed, or they had intentions to include questions that would be more specific and allow them to know if the individual is affiliated officially to any tribe. If this, not just identifying, but is this person actually considered an official citizen by any of the 5 civilized tribes? But after multiple discussions with Native leaders, of course, the agency kind of pushed back on including this question. So they came to a conclusion of not including it. And for 2 reasons, 2 main reasons. One was they thought that individual enrollment is totally the responsibility of the tribes because they're sovereign nations. Second, they were scared that the data would not match up with what people that self-identify as natives and what they actually have as enrollments. And that is not surprising, and it could be justified by many reasons. Because as Jayda already said this, knowing that now claiming a Native identity comes with multiple benefits, they might have just be like, we're just protecting what is ours. But that was just a peek to contextualize what is the amount and how many people actually identify as Native in the United States. But today, we're more interested specifically on Black Native Americans. So we're going to talk more in depth about that. I'm going to go against the rules of presentations. I'm going to read off the slides, but I really do think that my audience won't tell. I'm only doing this because I trust you guys. Hopefully you don't. It's not that big of a deal. It's just questions. So first of all, we want to know, where did this start? All of us, or a lot of us, know that indigenous people or Native Americans were the first people that were enslaved on this land. For some reason, or many reasons, that didn't necessarily work out how it was supposed to. Therefore, African people were brought to this land and took natives' place, which led to a genocide that we all know as the transatlantic slave trade. But knowing that Africans came to the United States as slaves, but to who? To who actually? Did the native people own slaves? I would propose that let's watch this small video, and I think it might have an impacting answer to it. I think we're having a little bit of technical problem, but that will be sorted.
Hello everyone, I'm Sam Ford. Earlier this month in our 7 Inside Reports, I took a personal journey to look at a largely unknown chapter of Black history when my ancestors and thousands of other blacks were slaves, not of the whites, but of the Indians. Well, a lot of people responded who'd missed some of the segments and who wanted to know more about the subject. So today you'll see it all and more, and get your pencils. At the end we'll have not a test, but an address and phone number where you can get more information. Every summer at Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Indians sponsor their Trail of Tears pageant, the story of how the U.S. government robbed the so-called 5 civilized tribes of their homelands in the South and moved them by force to Oklahoma. They don't tell about the thousands of blacks the tribes brought with them, their slaves.
My mammy and pappy belonged to a part Cherokee named W.P. Thompson when I was born.
The woman reading is my sister, Elaine Ford Staton, but the words are those of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Thompson Pettit, whose Georgia-born parents were brought by the Cherokees over the trail. Johnson Thompson was Phyllis's brother.
Before that, Pappy had been owned by 3 different masters. One was the rich Joe Van, who lived down at Weber's Fall, and another was Chief Lowry of the Cherokees.
My cousin, Maurice Shepard, reading the words of his great-grandfather. The interviews were conducted 52 years ago here at Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, when both my great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, and her brother, Johnson Thompson, were in their 80s, part of a federal writers project.
So I believe that answered our question. But it's interesting to know that what he was referring to, as he said at the end of the video, this was a federal writing program that the federal government actually managed to get slave interviews and documented them. So that all of these interviews are basically available in the Library of Congress. So with that being said, I want to ask a question: who was aware of this? Because to be honest, I was certainly not. Before doing this research, I was certainly not. And if we are aware of it, or we weren't, like, how did that happen? How did that fall in? Was that purposely taken out of history? Was this part skipped, or was it intentional? Was it not intentional? Because I went to high school. I did, I learned slavery. I learned about slavery, American history, but this was never mentioned. And I'm currently in an African-American studies class here at Iowa State, but yet this is not one of the modules. So why is it that we don't hear about these things? And our interviews allowed us to interview beautiful people, and they shared a lot of, it was hard because sometimes being honest is hard. And we were allowed to know, like, even on certain reservations, which Helen would get more into, that even on the reservations, they teach slavery, but they don't necessarily teach the implication of natives in slavery. So, but all of us know slavery ended, so everything should have been good. But what necessarily went wrong? And as Jayda mentioned at the beginning, the original treaties were allowed. The original treaties allowed us to know that everything should have sorted out. The slaves were freed. They should have been integrated into the tribes, but for some reason, the government came back with something else called the Dosro. The Dosro was a commission that inherited its name from its first chairman, Henry Dawes, and had one job, was to convince Native people to enroll into a federal document and give up their lands and let the federal government manage it for them. We might say they succeeded or not, but yet the final version of the Dosro represents the official members of all the 5 civilized tribes, but only the eligible members. So insisting on what is eligible and what is not, that's where we want to kick in. How did they measure or evaluate that someone was eligible or not? And that was where we touch on the blood quantum. And this was the original deal, but we can fast forward to the blood quantum. As we can see, the blood quantum refers to the degree of ancestry of a person. If I could get that, yep. Just that slide, yeah, the original capture of the blood quantum. You can go back one slide. So as we can see, this is the original picture of the Dosro. And as Jayda mentioned it, there were citizens that were full-blooded Native, and there were freedmen that were they were attributed a fraction of Native blood. As we can see, the column that says blood, the ones that say full are the ones that they consider citizens, and the ones that are attributed fractions are the freedmen. So going more into the blood quantum, but the blood quantum was first used in 1705 in Virginia. And it wasn't necessarily used in favor of Native Americans. It was more likely they were trying to use it against them, just to keep track of how much an individual holded of Native blood, and they used it as a factor of intimidation in order to push them to breed into a white majority, as Jayda already mentioned. But yet, over time, some Native tribes adapted this practice and used it for themselves to actually measure who was eligible or who was not. Meaning, like, if you can't necessarily justify the amount of Native blood that you hold and what they're asking for, you might not necessarily be considered an official citizen of a tribe. But to get another opinion on it, we wanna get into an interview that Dr. Antonio Treyer of the Miji State University was interviewed by Michelle Martin. And this is what he had to say about blood quantum.
Okay, well, explain that term, if you would, blood quantum. What is that? And talk more, if you would, about what role it can play in determining tribal identity.
Well, most of the 571 federally recognized reservations in the United States use blood quantum as the primary criteria for determining who can be a citizen of that Native nation. What it is it's an old-fashioned term for a proven percentage of Native blood.
So before I hand it over to Helen, if you guys have any questions related to what I said, like, I want to also acknowledge and clarify that blood quantum is not necessarily used by all tribes. All the tribes are sovereign nations, so each one has their own way of dealing with things, and not all of them demand the same amount of blood quantum. Each one of them have different constitutions. So it's not necessarily like everyone uses it the same way. And Helen will get more into that when she goes into the details with the interviews that we did. But just to keep in mind that we just took a general approach. That's why we will be offering like more sources to learn more about our topic. With that being said, I mean, Helen, go ahead, take us off.
Perfect. Thank you, Malcolm. So as Malcolm said and Jayda said too, I know we've covered a lot of things so far in the presentation. And so by all means, as I transition into the individual stories section, please feel free to have some additional questions in the chat. And we'll make sure to keep an eye on those and address them if we have time in the middle or at the very least at the end. And so the part that I'm going to be talking about is some of the individual stories. And an essential part of this research for us was discussing who identifies as Black Native American, who identifies as Native American, but knows Black Native Americans in their community, to really understand what the individual experience is of Black Native American people. And then, like we said, the nuances of that experience as well. And so first, I want to start out with a couple of historical stories. And so the first one is Loving versus Virginia, which a lot of people know as a historical case that then laid the groundwork for interracial marriage, for the fact that they were allowed to be married. However, a lot of people don't know of as the article states, the Afro-Indian identity of Mildred Loving. And it's something that her son, Mark, brought up in an article, in an interview a few years ago in memory of this historic case, was that she did not only identify as Black, she also was very closely identified with her Native American heritage. And so this again is the erasure of Black Native American identity and that intersectionality. I also want to talk about Armstrong Archer. His Compendium of Slavery is one of the first known pieces written by an individual of Black, Native American and Black ancestry, and an important example of his individual experiences within it. We also want to discuss the influences of American society as we talk about the challenges of intersectionality within certain minoritized groups. We can't do that without recognizing the immense pain and harm caused by the United States and our society, as well as how that is integrated structurally in structural racism or institutional racism that continues to perpetuate the problem. And so we want to recognize that the government is a patriarchal system that systematically disempowers minoritized groups, whether that is through structures and for example, redlining that causes generational poverty, among other things, as Malcolm mentioned, with intervening within sovereign issues with different identity groups. And then, so as I talked about emphasizing those divisions, also causing internalized colonization, living in a country with all of these issues continuing to happen, means that the people living here, in some cases, can then internalize those systems as a way to exist within it without worse oppression and harm being done to them. And so there is really no way to go between that without recognizing the harm that the government has done. And so we also want to talk about some more recent social movements, including BIPOC. And so the word BIPOC, it means Black and Indigenous people of color. And it's a really important term that uplifts Native American and Black humanity, and also recognizes the legacies of resistance that both of these groups have had to a long history of colonization and white supremacy. And it also recognizes how unique there are certain disparities and injustices that specifically impact Black and Native American communities, and therefore the additional work that has to be done to combat these. Also with the Black Lives Matter movement and how this movement didn't only involve people that solely identified as Black, but as we get into our interviews, one of the people that we talked to, Julius Buckner, identified how they were on the front lines of the protest with their shared heritage as a very important part of that protest. So the first person we talked to is Morgan Bear. And Morgan, we can see that you're here today and we appreciate you being here. And so Morgan is of the Meskwaki in Tama, and she's a graduate student studying student affairs, and she identifies as Native American. And as we talked to Morgan, we got to hear more in depth about how her tribe talks about Black Native American identity and really the nuances of her growing up in her tribe. And so one of the things that was really important to share today is that not everyone in the tribe holds certain views either one way or the other. While there are historical views, it is very much an individual conversation between tribe members and family members. Morgan shared that within her tribe, almost everybody knows somebody who is of Black Native American descent or has a grandchild or a nephew or a niece. In her case, her sister has children who are Black and Native American because that's who her sister's partner is Black. And so just recognizing that there are very many individuals of Black Native American identity within her tribe. She shared that while most of the elders and community members within her tribe had very open views and were more welcoming to having these dialogues and conversations, there were a few conservative members who were holding on to previous beliefs and had maybe words of judgment to say about people who were Native Americans within their tribe who were choosing to associate with Black people, whether it was being friends with Black people or have children with Black people. However, her tribe is beginning to engage in these conversations of identity and recognizing how challenging it is to have the intersectionality of shared history, different shared histories of colonialism, and then on top of that, to then have minoritized identity within a minoritized larger identity. And so as a part of this conversation, we really got to better understand the differences between Black Native American identity, in that some people are Black Native American because their ancestors were slaves owned by the tribe. And then as that continues down, that's how they got their heritage. But now also in contemporary times, there's also tribe members who are marrying or having children with people who are Black. And so then today, that's where there's another way that people are identifying as Black Native American. We also talked to Julius Buckner, and they are a Black Lakota person who is reclaiming ties to their Lakota community. And we really want to emphasize that for Julius, this is a journey that they are going on as somebody who is also trans, and really trying to identify how they can continue to build these ties. Growing up, having conversations with their aunt and learning about the land and other things. But now on this journey, Julius really shared with us that this is an exercise. It's not something that just happens, but more so something that they are intentionally putting work into to grow their sense of community to their Lakota identity. And this was especially important talking about identity and trans identity and then kinship too. One of the things that Julius really emphasized to us is how important kinship is within the Lakota community, and also how fluid it is. In the sense they shared meeting somebody and a few meetings later, that person calling them cousin, and also recognizing how welcoming the Lakota community has been of trans individuals as a primary part of what is important to them and their values as a tribe. We also want to share that on this journey of reclamation, Julius said they faced some challenges and intimidation, not from any person directly, but more so the intimidation of reclaiming a heritage that they hadn't been closely connected to their entire life, and trying to discover what that journey was like. And so on a personal level, they felt completely welcomed by the community, but trying to work through the bureaucracy and all the laws and rules that we've shared that the US government has instituted to continue to bring divide within these groups. And finally, Julius shared the power that a Black Native American identity presents, and the threat of two historically minoritized groups coming together. And so how powerful are we alone? But how much more powerful and threatening are we to the patriarchy are we when we come together? And before I pass over to Jayda, I just want to share this project. This is the Indivisible project by the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian. And so these are just, as we talked about before, that Native American families, Black Native American families can come in all types of people. And so these are just some 9 families. I also want to point out that the Garifuna are Afro-Indigenous identities from the Caribbean. And so that Black Native American identities are not only in North America, that they exist in other parts of this continent and region as well.
All right, so to kind of wrap up this whole presentation before we go into any questions that anybody might have before we end today. So just some recommendations that we have for the Ames community and the Iowa State community as a whole. And so some of the recommendations kind of just include awareness of other identities. And so kind of just bringing forth that understanding that there is intersectionality within multiple communities. And so it's not just always Black natives, but it can be Hispanics and natives, Hispanics and Blacks, things like that. And so just kind of having that awareness that intersectionality does exist and that there is sometimes lack of research behind it, things like that. And then moving forward with that, we have the acknowledgement of shared histories. And so using that understanding to identify that what happened in the past isn't always told in the present. And so like we stated with the natives and slaves, not everybody knows that, not everybody has learned that. And sometimes that's kind of just things that you have to find out for yourself. And so acknowledging that shared history is very important as well, going into creating that change for intersectional identities. And then so here in the Iowa State community, kind of understanding that there can be some change as well within academics, things like that. And so one that we could propose is the collaborative experimental source with the African American Studies and Native American Studies Department. And so I know sometimes it's not easy to find a professor that would just all of a sudden jump up and say, hey, yeah, I want to teach Black Native American Studies. And so kind of just finding that line with maybe having the input from African American Studies that Natives were a part of that history, but also vice versa with the American Indian Studies classes. And so just finding that thin line of inputting those factors would be important to acknowledge as well. And then also the recognition of other intersectional identities within numerous systems of oppression. And so kind of just stating back to the last slide with like Afro-Latinx, Latinx and Native Americans, just identifying that there is more systems of oppression than just one. And so maybe inputting, you could have groups, you could have clubs, things like that, more conferences and anything within finances, I guess. But yeah, just recognizing that there is just more than one system of oppression within Iowa State communities. And then listed here, we just kind of have additional resources that anybody can look into. We have the By Blood documentary, which was recommended to us, as well as the Cherokee Nation versus Nash. It was a Supreme Court ruling. And then Everything You Wanted to Know About Indians But Were Afraid to Ask was the book from Antoine Neuer that Malcolm suggested as well. And then that is our works cited. And so we are more than welcome to answer any questions that you guys have right now before we wrap up for the day.
Hi, this is Tammy. I am having a hard time bringing up any questions. However, I did find a few of them within the chat. One is, why is being recognized by your tribe so important, or to be on the roll?
I think they came in just after my section, so I can address that. As I think Helen also emphasized on this with our interview with Julius, everything is important. Imagine a lot of people, I think, are aware of a family tree. You know what I'm saying? Like, imagine what you pass on to your children. If your children learn that, oh, for somewhat what you're claiming, other people are saying, oh, that's not actually true, that he's not part of here, that puts in so much that takes away energy from them. Because what we were plays a lot into what we want to become. It's easier to know, like, okay, my ancestors were actually something in order for you to reproduce that. But it takes way more energy for someone to say, oh yeah, I started from scratch. You go through mental stress and it's just downgrading. So just to know where you're from, that's just a powerful thing. To have all the pieces to the puzzle, it helps out a lot, and it saves you a lot of time in your achievements.
One of the other questions was, how does one test blood to determine how Native American they are?
That would be an easy one for now, because DNA tests are available and they're just comparable to like traits that they already have, just as how people do DNA tests to know where they came from Africa. And I think those are getting very popular for now.
And the final one that I got through the chat is, what do we know about closed rolls for tribal enrollment?
Does anybody want to address that, or you just want me to?
Yeah, I can hop on that too. Well, specifically closed roles, I don't have experience with that specific term, but what we were hearing, and like Jayda talked about, with more people being interested in identifying as Native American when there were potential benefits associated with that. So in the way that some tribes might have closed enrollment as a way of better protecting resources for the members that were had already identified as official or existing members of the tribe. And so that would be a way that tribes are able to determine based on their sovereignty. However, recognizing too that that official Native American identity and that conversation continues to remain open and is identified by individual tribes. So while tribes might close that to preserve their resources, that does continue to be an ongoing conversation, and tribes continue to reconsider and modify their constitutions based on events and based on discussions that they continue to have as well.
That's all the questions that I have access to. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah, I put one in the chat. My name is Tisha Carter Smith. I have been following the work of Henry Louis Gates Jr. and his work on ancestry in America. I am aware of Native Americans who own slaves. However, I'm not aware of tribes procreating with their slaves, as white slave owners have done. So I'm a little bit confused how, if a family of Blacks were owned by Native Americans, that does not necessarily mean that they were Native Americans themselves. I'm not quite sure how you made that leap.
Yeah, I can respond to that. I also follow Dr. Henry Gates at Harvard University. He's great. The connection between that is that the fact that after they freed the slaves, there was a treaty signed that they agreed that they would not just free them, but integrate them into the tribes, and that they would own full citizenship as any other native of that tribe. And that was done. But the Dawes Roll came after with benefits. So basically, the federal government intervened into the roll, like take the list that actually considers who is eligible for the land that they'll be giving out and who is not. And that's when they became, they were already referred to as freedmen, as you can hear said in the name, they were freed men, but it was more I would say had more meaning behind it when they were listed on the DAWS roll as a free men, meaning they're not fully native and they're not considered to be a legitimate citizen of that tribe. Does that answer your question?
That does. I missed that part about how they were excluded from the DAWS roll. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. No worries. It's just exactly like African Americans were brought to the United States after we were freed. We're now American. So, or something close to that.
Are there any other questions?
And as we wait for more questions, I was going to also recognize the people that were sharing personal experiences throughout the presentation. I know, Alicia, thank you. I saw an experience you shared. And so that's something that we hadn't realized as we started this presentation, as well as how many people might have shared Native American, Black identity, or shared intersectional identity within the Native community in general, and the opportunity we've had to have these conversations with people about it. And so by all means, if anybody else has experiences they feel comfortable sharing, or the ways that this presentation has challenged what you all already knew, we'd also really appreciate hearing that.
Yeah. Just to wrap up, I would like to also thank all my teammates. It was a great journey. It wasn't easy, but at least, you know, we got here. And I would also like people to understand this is not a topic that is easy to actually talk about. And as we said, we all come from not the same type of backgrounds, but backgrounds that would allow us to understand the point of view where you touch on so sensitive when it comes to intersectionality. So we do understand. So it's not always to talk about it. That doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't talk about it. So we have no negative intentions to touch on anything, but it's just like something that, although it is sensitive, we must also address it in order to bring a solution to it.
And then kind of just adding on to what Malcolm said, I guess I'd like to thank everybody who came today, as well as my teammates, but as well as all of our advisors. Brian Lay, thank you for kind of just guiding us through this journey, checking up on us whenever we had difficulties, questions, things like that. As well as Joel Mitchell, Japana Kellogg, as well as Dr. Ashley Guerin for kind of introducing us to this whole thing and sticking with us through this ISCORE journey.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add to that is everybody that we interviewed, thank you so much, Professor Jen McClung, Morgan Bear, and Julius Buckner. Thank y'all all for sharing your stories and information with us as we were trying to do this research and try and make an impact.
And then before we end, should we get a quick picture with everybody? If that's okay with everyone.
To that note, if you would like to be included in the picture, please turn on your cameras.
If you don't feel comfortable, that's fine too. We still got your name. It's all good.
Okay, I'm gonna do a quick countdown for those of us that like to be smiling or not smiling and want to pose, okay? 3, 2, 1. I'm gonna do one more over here. Awesome. Thank you everybody so much. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yes, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you.
Great job, you all.
Thank you.
And now it's over and you can breathe.
So you know we weren't breathing. How did you know? Mm.
Wait, come on. Yeah. Yay, team. Okay. How do y'all feel? Should we pause the recording so that we don't lose it? Whoever's